on DRM Digital Radio.
With shortwave and medium wave international and regional stations broadcasting on Digital Radio Mondiale, we offer you the best content in sound quality to enjoy.
The BBC and Digital Radio Mondiale. Better radio altogether.
It's 6 o'clock in London. Hello and welcome to Newsday on the BBC World Service with Lawrence Pollard.
President Trump says his plan to ban immigration to the EU last for 60 days and apply only to those seeking permanent residency. We get the latest on that.
We'll also hear from the Deputy Prime Minister of Georgia on how this former Soviet republic has so far managed to keep its number of COVID-19 infections low.
A report from Germany as the country cautiously and slowly returns to life with mass testing in its sites.
Contact tracing is the most important tool to limit the spread of the pandemic as much as possible.
And fewer cars, more cycle lanes. That's one thing the northern Italian city of Milan wants to change after a pandemic. Business and sports coming your way too on Newsday after this bulletin of the latest world news. Hello, I'm Chris Barrow with the BBC News. The United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has said that as countries take extraordinary measures to support their economies during the coronavirus pandemic, they should ensure that public funds are invested in the future and not the past. Our environment correspondent Matt McGrath has more details.
Speaking to mark the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, Mr. Guterres underlined once again that the coronavirus pandemic is the biggest challenge the world has faced since the Second World War. But the unfolding environmental crisis is an even deeper emergency for the planet, the UN Secretary-General said. Rescue packages for ailing businesses should be tied to green jobs. Subsidies to fossil fuel companies must end, he said, and polluters must pay for their pollution. Just like deadly viruses, greenhouse gases do not respect national boundaries, he warned. The only way of beating either challenge is through sustained international cooperation.
President Trump has said he will temporarily halt immigration into the United States for foreign nationals seeking permanent residency, a move that he said would protect American jobs during the coronavirus crisis. At a White House briefing, Mr. Trump said it would be wrong for Americans laid off during the pandemic to be replaced with immigrant labour flown in from abroad.
This pause will be in effect for 60 days, after which the need for any extension or modification will be evaluated based on economic conditions at the time. This order will only apply to individuals seeking a permanent residency. In other words, those receiving green cards will not apply to those entering on a temporary basis. We want to protect our U.S. workers, and I think as we move forward, we will become more and more protective of them.
A senior U.S. disease expert has said that a second wave of coronavirus cases could be worse than the current one, as it would probably coincide with the start of the flu season. Robert Redfield, the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, issued the warning as several US states prepared to reopen their economies. Dr. Redfield said social distancing must continue. The video streaming company Netflix has seen subscriber numbers surge this year as lockdowns around the world keep people at home. Almost 16 million people created accounts in the first 3 months of the year, nearly double the figure for the previous 3 months. The company's profits have also doubled. Reed Hastings is Netflix's chief executive.
People want entertainment. They want to be able to escape and connect, whether times are difficult or joyous. That's pulling up. We had an increase in subscriber growth in March. That's, essentially a pull forward of the rest of the year. So our guess is that subs will be light in Q3 and Q4 relative to prior years because of that.
World news from the BBC. US and European oil markets have been hit by further volatility as the coronavirus causes a major drop in demand. The US benchmark, the West Texas Intermediate, drops to close to minus $40 a barrel before staging a recovery to climb to just above $10 a barrel. The price of the European benchmark, Brent crude, dropped below $20 a barrel for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The Spanish Parliament will decide today whether to extend for a further 2 weeks the national lockdown that's been in place since the middle of March. From Madrid, here's Guy Hedgecoe.
Spain has had a tightly controlled lockdown, reflecting its status as the European country with the second highest number of coronavirus deaths after Italy. Today, Congress is expected to approve Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez's proposal to extend the measure by 2 weeks. There's lively debate over how and when restrictions should be lifted in Spain, especially as the virus's impact appears to have stabilised over the last 2 weeks. From this Sunday, children will be allowed to leave their homes for the first time in 6 weeks, although only to take short walks accompanied by adults.
Reports from Kazakhstan say that a 200-bed infectious diseases hospital has been built in less than 2 weeks in the capital Nur-Sultan. 2 similar hospitals are being set up in 2 of Kazakhstan's other cities, Almaty and Shymkent. Kazakhstan has reported just under 2,000 cases of coronavirus so far. 19 people have died. And the Democratic Republic of Congo is due to begin easing strict lockdown measures today in the capital Kinshasa, which has seen nearly all of the country's recorded cases of coronavirus. But the authorities say that only residents in the upmarket riverside suburb of Gombe will be allowed to leave their homes. Banks, food shops and some businesses are also due to reopen. That's the latest BBC News.
And many thanks for the latest. Hello, welcome to Newsday. Once again, Lawrence here in the studio, James presenting from home in North London, a few miles away, extreme social distancing for many good reasons. The US, Germany, Georgia, Italy, that's where our updates on the progress of the pandemic will take us. In the next half hour, we'll be talking about carless and smogless Milan. We'll be talking about Germany's success story in mass testing. And the Deputy Prime Minister of Georgia joins us. Georgia being singled out as, well, some people are describing it as a miracle, the way they've managed to control the outbreak of the virus. We find out how and why and what the lessons might be. Plus the sport and the business. That's Newsday.
We start, though, in the United States, the country which has perhaps been most affected by the spread of COVID-19, with more than 80,000 cases and around 45,000 deaths. Plenty of economic and political ramifications too. President Trump has stated that all immigration into the country will be halted for those seeking full-time residency. He said this was to protect American jobs and the economy for as long as the crisis lasts.
By pausing immigration, we'll help put unemployed Americans first in line for jobs as America reopens. So important. It would be wrong and unjust for Americans laid off by the virus to be replaced with new immigrant labor flown in from abroad. We must first take care of the American worker, take care of the American worker. As we move forward, we'll examine what additional immigration-related measures should be put in place.
Well, that comes as a senior disease expert from the Centers for Disease Control, the US health body, has warned that a second wave of the virus could eclipse that of the current pandemic, and this as several US states prepare to reopen their economies. For more, I've been speaking to Yasmina Boutaleb, health policy reporter at The Washington Post.
The CDC director told my colleague that a second wave of the virus will very likely coincide with flu season. You know, even though we have a pretty bad wave of infections right now, you know, in the U.S. it's at about 800,000 and 45,000 deaths. The outbreak really sort of started at the end of our flu season here, you know, in March and April. What he said in the interview was that it could be really bad and be an enormous strain on the health system because a normal flu season is already a big strain on the health system. And the second wave is likely to coincide with the onset of the flu season and then another huge wave of infection. So it could actually be even worse than what we're seeing right now.
Presumably, though, the thought process is there will be a period of time, weeks, months, whatever it is, to prepare possibly for a second, perhaps more deadly wave. What would be then the best way of using that preparation time?
I think, you know, obviously one of the major problems the U.S. has had is there's been shortages of things that are needed for treatment and to keep frontline staff safe. There have been shortages of testing kits, which are coming up again as some states are trying to reopen, and they say they can't really do that safely without widespread testing. So just sort of basic supplies, test kits, supplies for healthcare workers are all huge concerns that I think, if there is time to prepare for a second wave, the hope is that the government would use that time to stock up on supplies and be better prepared than the U.S. was for the first wave.
There's also perhaps a bigger political question, isn't there, whether President Trump would want to take those kinds of steps, which would be very difficult for the economy, perhaps even difficult for his re-election chances.
Right. I mean, the president has staked so much of his re-election on the strength of the economy. And until, coronavirus hit the world and the U.S. extremely hard, the thought was he was pretty much unstoppable. There was record employment, really strong growth and sustained growth in the economy, and that all sort of came crashing down. And I think the thought among the president and many of his advisors is that if the economy doesn't recover and rebound in time for the election, then his re-election is sort of gone.
It's difficult, of course, to generalize across such a big nation, but I mean, do you think people are prepared for a second wave of very tough lockdown measures, or even perhaps these ones continuing for an extended period of time? You've seen the freedom demonstrations and so on. There are frustrations.
Right. I mean, you definitely saw the protests over the weekend in some of these states with people saying that it was time to loosen restrictions and to ease restrictions. I think there are people who sort of feel, including in the administration, who feel that the social distancing guidelines and the lockdown that we've had for the last several weeks was an overreaction and unnecessary, and that the economy just can't sustain that. So I think it would be very hard for a lot of people to relive this period, especially if we go back to some semblance of normalcy in the next couple of months. I think, depending especially on the president's posture, you saw him at the end of last week saying, liberate Michigan, liberate various states, urging governors to lift social distancing guidelines, that you'll see some people respond to that, especially if that's his rhetoric in the fall as well.
People who have wanted perhaps to minimize the impact of COVID-19 have often compared it to flu, haven't they?
They have, and you saw that a lot, including from the president early on in February and even in early March, saying, essentially, why are we worrying so much about this? It's essentially the flu, and the flu kills way more people. But I think the big difference, and I think the CDC director and other public health officials have tried to stress this point, is there is no vaccine and there's no treatment for coronavirus, which makes it much more dangerous. If there's a big crush of cases, there's really nothing to do but to sort of treat the symptoms as of right now. I think the hope is that there will be some sort of therapeutic by the fall that will make it a bit more manageable. But I think every public health expert and more people have sort of understood that it's not comparable to a flu season.
Yasmin Abu Talib from the Washington Post, a health policy reporter there, talking on the comments by a senior American health official that a second wave of this COVID-19 pandemic in the US could be even more deadly, as it would likely come at the same time as flu would be a major problem for the US health system.
Well, we're talking about so many examples, aren't we? We're talking about Germany a little later. We're talking about Italy. We've just been talking about the US. Now, comparisons with various countries' experiences are difficult. We were talking, for example, about Singapore earlier in the programme. Very successful approach initially to the pandemic, now facing a second wave of infections. But the more places we talk about, the theory is the more we learn. So let's try to learn from the experience of Georgia. To remind you, a small country of around 4 million people between Russia to the north, Turkey to the south, Iran in the area as well, all countries suffering badly. But at the moment, Georgia has only 4 recorded fatalities, and it's being much praised for its operations. So what has been done, and what lessons might we learn? On the line now is the Deputy Prime Minister of Georgia, Maya Chikatishvili. Very warm welcome to the programme. Now, the first thing that you did, as I understand, is you suspended flights from Iran. Then very quickly after that, you suspended flights to Italy, both hotspots. How much debate was there in late February, which is, God, doesn't seem that long ago, but, the beginning when people were waking up to this, how much debate was there in government about what to do?
Good morning, Lawrence. First of all, thank you for your interest in Georgia, and you're completely right. So actually, it's already 2 months after our first case was recorded, but we have just 408 cases till now, and unfortunately, but we have 4 fatalities. The reason of our success, how it is interpreted now, is our early and decisive actions. Actually, we were very much following the advices of our healthcare professionals, the epidemiologists, and we started acting very early. Starting from 22nd of January, we started temperature screening at all arrivals, and we have imposed quite strict rules for screening and for screening of the passengers arriving, especially for the zones which were considered to be hotspots.
And I'm sure this is one reason why very, very quickly you banned flights as well. But was there immediate agreement? I mean, was there much choice in what you had to do?
Actually, we had very good communication with from the very beginning, because we understood that the battle with coronavirus is a battle that you can win only with the support of your population, because no government can treat this case alone. And we opted to have very clear communication with our citizens from the very beginning. And I would like to use this opportunity as well to show that our population was very responsive.
And have you locked down the population? Just remind us what the situation is in Georgia.
Yes, we have imposed a lockdown on in end of March. Actually, it's 1 month after the lockdown was imposed. But this lockdown even is a balance what we were trying to cope on the two battles: battle with coronavirus and battle to just to also help our economy to strive in this very difficult situation.
Of course, because this is the difficult balance, and it's a difficult political decision to make.
Yes.
Would you just explain one thing for us, Maya, which is the importance you have, as I understand it from reading the background, a very well-known test laboratory which has been working. How important, as an element of the strategy, has been testing people for the virus? How much have you been able to do?
We had, with support of our strategic partner, with the US, we had a very good laboratory, you could be right, our Luger Center for Disease and Control, and our national system for the disease and control was very well supported by our partners. So that showed the result, and our specialists are quite well equipped with that. Lab testing is one of the instruments, is very important instruments, and we have tested more than 7,000 persons till now. All of them were supported based on the guidelines that were elaborated by our national.
Okay, that's quite a high number and very impressive. And one thing that everyone is talking about now is the danger of a second wave, how you release the lockdown. What is your thinking? Many people looking to you as an example of good practice. What is your thinking now when it comes to easing the lockdown and what you do next? How to avoid that second peak?
First of all, we have to be very careful with easing the restrictions, because we'll understand that it's quite tempting to open everything as soon as the figures are going down. But of course, we have to be careful. We have to be also following very strictly guidelines for the social distancing. And I believe that everyone have to understand that we have to adapt with the virus before the vaccine is in place or a cure. So we, of course, have to adapt to live to
adapting means that certain changes will be permanent. There's going to be a change in life for the foreseeable future, yeah?
Of course.
Yeah.
For some period of time, we have to live together with the rise of virus, and it means that, of course, we already start working on the plan for the opening up the economy again, and this plan, of course, considers the gradual opening up of some businesses which low risks, and of course testing will be a very useful and supportive tool in controlling the spread of the virus. But of course the social distancing measures are very important.
They're going to have to remain. Listen, best wishes to you as well. Hope it all works. Lessons to be learned from the experience in Georgia. That was the Deputy Prime Minister of Georgia, Maya Chikitishvili. Look up the Lugar Lab. Interesting stories swirling around that as well, in terms of both information and misinformation as well.
This is Newsday on the BBC World Service. Lawrence Pollard, James Cotwell and Matthew Kenyon, who has the sport.
Hi, James. The Dutch Football Association says its leagues have effectively been ended by a government extension to a ban on public events until September the 1st. It came on the same day that European football's governing body, UEFA, said it hoped that most leagues in the continent could restart in June, with the extended season completed at the end of August. And away from the pandemic, as we wait to hear what happens with the Saudi-led takeover bid for English Premier League club Newcastle United, the league itself has has been urged to scrutinise the proposed deal. Human rights campaigners, including Amnesty International, have questioned it, and now so have one of the league's biggest broadcasters. There's a lot going on with this, but beIN Sport is, of course, based in Qatar, which is in bitter dispute with Saudi Arabia, amongst others, and one of the expressions of that is the claim, vigorously denied by the Saudis, that Saudi is behind the hijacking of beIN Premier League rights by a broadcaster called beOutQ. beIN Sport say the Premier League needs to investigate because, quote, it is no exaggeration to say that the future economic model of football is at stake.
Sport and politics, football and politics in a big way there.
Even when no one's playing.
Yeah. Matthew Kenyon with the sport. Many thanks indeed. It's 20 past the hour. Let's go to business now. And Andrew Wood is standing by on the line from Hong Kong with a story of one of the world's most valuable companies partnering with India's richest man. So the company, the richest man, what are they going to do?
Well, the company is Facebook. The richest man is Mukesh Ambani. And Facebook's going to invest nearly $6 billion in a mobile internet company, Reliance Jio, which is part of Reliance Industry, which is owned by Mukesh Ambani. So they're going to get a 10% stake in this company. Facebook's already, WhatsApp, its chat service, is quite popular in India already. It's got about 400 million users, which when you consider, a country of about, I think, 1.2 billion people, that's pretty good going. That's about nearly a third. Mukesh Ambani has been a very successful businessman. You don't get to become India's richest man without it, but his company has an awful lot of debt at the moment. And, the $6 billion will come in handy to try and pay down some of that debt. I mean, this is interesting. It's a low-cost internet service. So, it's basically it offers very low prices for data. It's managed to basically carve out a nice space for itself. There's not really a lot of competition for it just at the moment. So this is interesting for Facebook. It's tried to get into India before in other ways, and it hasn't been completely successful.
Fascinating. Many thanks indeed. Andrew Wood on the line from Hong Kong with the business news.
A few minutes ago, we heard from a country which has been praised for its handling of the coronavirus crisis, Georgia. Germany is another, with its early mass testing and an effective lockdown. And now the world is watching as the authorities begin to gradually ease some restrictions, relying on more testing and contact tracing to keep the outbreak under control. Our Berlin correspondent, Jenny Hill, sent this report.
As they drained their cups and shouted for more, Oktoberfest revellers had no idea that a virus would one day silence the party. Announcing the cancellation, the Bavarian authorities said the risk of infection was simply too great. A teacher wearing a face mask opens the door to some pupils at a school in Berlin, just in time to take a socially distanced exam. Germany is cautiously feeling its way back to life. In many cities, small shops and car dealerships are back in business too. At the same time, more testing and a focus on contact tracing.
Contact tracing is the most important tool to limit the spread of the pandemic as much as possible.
Every time someone tests positive, public health officials like Knut Mildner-Spindler must track down anyone they could have infected.
Of course, it's not always possible to find everyone. We depend on the support and the memory of the infected person.
Knut would approve of what the German army has been up to recently. A group of soldiers clutch mobile phones and walk around each other, staring at the screens. They're helping developers test a phone app which could identify potential chains of infection. But there are concerns about privacy, and the technology is considered to be at least a month from being ready. In the meantime, Germany's studying its own population, running a number of antibody studies.
We also need to have a better idea clinically. If antibodies are detected, how does that really reflect in terms of protection? And if it reflects in terms of protection, how long does that protection last?
Professor Gerhard Krause from the Helmholtz Center of Infection Research is running one of the studies and says existing antibody tests aren't yet up to scratch.
Because the test sometimes reacts to antibodies that have resulted from another coronavirus infection, this will then turn into a positive result, but it's not positive with respect to reacting to this specific coronavirus.
Oktoberfest would have put more than €1 billion into local pockets. Germany's economy is suffering too. Gatherings still banned, pubs and restaurants still closed. The country may have got the outbreak under control, but as it tentatively takes its first few steps out of lockdown, scientists and politicians are watching anxiously. It's far too soon to celebrate.
Jenny Hill reporting from Berlin there.
"25 minutes past the hour." James and Lawrence with Newsday. Very warm welcome, BBC World Service. Now, there have been many amazing pictures that you can see online of cityscapes around the world before the pandemic and after, showing no sky and beautiful blue sky. Now, our next story is related to that. It's not just, though, about pretty pictures. There is possibly a big issue here. Scientists are examining links between virus hotspots and pollution hotspots. For example, let's talk about Milan and whether Milan can change its hugely polluted existence up to the explosion of the pandemic for something different. Marco Ferrari, our next guest, is president of Genitori Anti-Smog. It's a campaign, the title translates as Parents Against Smog, have been pushing for moves to green Milan since the early 2000s. And Marco, I wonder if you hope in some way out of this dreadful situation, are you hoping that there could be a change in attitudes towards urban pollution? Can you take advantage of the virus in that way?
No, we cannot say like this because, frankly speaking, I'm a little sad since in these days the city is free of cars, not because we decided it, but only because of the coronavirus pandemic.
Yes, so exactly,
yeah, today the air is much cleaner, but the main reason is for a disease that is causing a lot of deaths. So from a certain point of view, we cannot be happy, of course.
Because the smog, of course, is generated by economic well-being, and people now, having dealt with the danger of death to their families in northern Italy, of course, are moving towards the idea of reopening the economy. Is there any way that you can put pressure on the government, on the authorities, to change the old habits, the old ways of doing things? Do you have any hope for change?
Yes, we have this hope because in the past we did a lot of advocacy, lobbying, communication. So we carried out projects in order to show to the city government that this different city is possible. For instance, we did some pilot project of tactical urbanism where we demonstrated that all these measures that the city is putting in place today, that they work well.
It's right. A different city is possible, but is a different city equally wealthy possible as well? Because the action is always what you at Genitori Anti-Smog want is you want people to make less money.
No, this is not true. This is not true. So let's say that as our name suggests, we started our activity with the main goal of fighting the air pollution in our city, Milan. But we changed our perspective. So nowadays we are fighting for a vision of living happily in a beautiful city. What does it mean? It doesn't mean that this is due to the, how to say, a recession, economic recession. We want we have the vision of transform the urbanism in order to ensure a people-friendly urban environment.
And when the Milanese authorities say that they're now going to look at trying to reduce reliance on motor vehicles and more cycle lanes and so on, is that enough? Is that a start?
It's a start, of course, but this could transform the city as we were suggesting for many years.
Right. Marco, many thanks indeed. Maybe your time has come. Marco Ferrari of Genitori Anti-Smog, Parents Against Smog in Milan. And do check out the suggestions by scientists of the link between, well, it's obviously economic development, but pollution hotspots and virus hotspots as well. It's something that quite a lot of them are looking into. Thank you to Marco. This is Newsday. News up next.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, and here's what's happening in the studio this week.
One of the most exciting young performers in classical music today is the Polish countertenor Jakub Józef Oliński. In February, he was preparing for a new operatic role in Germany, and he gave us access to a day in his life. Hear how he works on his distinctive voice.
In the studio at bbcworldservice.com/in-the-studio. This is the BBC on Digital Radio Mondiale. You can get all the latest news from the BBC 24 hours a day by heading online and visiting bbc.com/news.
The BBC on DRM for Europe. Better radio altogether.
Hello, welcome to Newsday from the BBC World Service with Lawrence Pollard and me, James Copnell.
We'll get the latest on the pandemic from Namibia, the country's newly appointed 23-year-old Deputy Minister.
We'll also head to Madagascar to get reaction to the President's decision to officially back a locally produced herbal remedy to combat COVID-19.
Making music in a time of virus as well, Ethiopian jazz legend Hailu Merja joins us a little bit later.
BBC News with Chris Barrow. The United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has said that the economic measures taken by countries during the coronavirus pandemic should ensure public funds are invested in jobs favourable to the environment and not on subsidising fossil fuels. He was speaking on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. President Trump has told a White House briefing that immigration to the United States for those seeking permanent residency will be suspended for at least 60 days. Farm labourers and high-tech employees on special visas will not be affected. The video streaming company Netflix has seen subscriber numbers and profits surge this year as lockdowns around the world keep people at home. But the company warned the pandemic had stopped almost all production of new films and series. The British government is facing questions over the time it took to join a European Union scheme to obtain medical equipment for the fight against coronavirus. It says the invitation was not received in time, but Brussels sources say Britain was given ample opportunity. The Democratic Republic of Congo will begin easing strict lockdown measures today in the capital Kinshasa for residents of the upmarket suburb of Gombe. Banks, food shops and some businesses are due to reopen, but people in the crowded poor suburbs will remain restricted. The Spanish Parliament will decide today whether to extend its national lockdown for 2 weeks. Spain has one of the highest rates of COVID-19 infections in the world, but the daily death toll has fallen. In other news, a team of scientists who failed in their attempt last year to locate the ship of the Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton has told the BBC it will take a monumental effort and at least a couple of icebreakers to achieve their goal. The Endurance, which sank in 1915, lies 3,000 metres under thick Antarctic ice. BBC News.
Thank you for the latest. This is Newsday with Lawrence and James. Namibia, Madagascar, Yemen, also some music as well. Ethiopian jazz coming up via Washington, D.C., but that's not so unusual. That's in about 20 minutes' time. Also, Matthew Kenyon here with the sport. Let's get going.
And we get going in Namibia as the COVID-19 pandemic rages on. The country's borders will remain closed and a partial lockdown stays in force until early May as part of national measures to contain the spread of the coronavirus. The country currently has 16 recorded cases and as yet no deaths. Well, just a week after the first case was recorded, Emma Theophilus was appointed Namibia's Deputy Minister for Information, Communication and Technology. And she's just 23, one of the youngest cabinet ministers, well, anywhere really. Her job is an important link between the government and people, the population, keeping them up to date with developments during the pandemic. And Emma joins us now from the Namibian capital, Windhoek. Should I call you minister, perhaps?
Yes, you may.
We'll keep it formal. Okay, fair enough. Talk us through a little bit the measures that the government is taking. They seem to be working so far.
Yes, definitely. We the president, Dr. Hage Geingob, the president of Namibia, declared a state of emergency on the 17th of March after we registered our first case on the 12th of March. And right after that, he initiated the partial lockdown of 2 regions in the country, and which was extended on the 17th of April recently to the whole country. For about 2 weeks now, we've only had 16 cases, where we have now 6 people who have recovered from those 16 cases. 10 are still active. However, we have still not registered any deaths. So it seems that our action early on seems to be creating an opportunity for us to flatten the curve before it even rises.
Given that there are so few cases, is there some resistance to a national lockdown?
Sorry, I didn't hear that question.
I just wondered that with so few cases recorded, so little evidence that people can see in front of their eyes of the problems of COVID-19, whether some people are reluctant to cooperate or understand, people don't understand the reason perhaps for such a full lockdown.
Yes, we have that issue. We still have people not adhering to the regulations put in place that have been gazetted to try to curb the further spread of the virus. We still have people attending functions in large groups. We have actually put a ban on internal travel from one area to another, but people still find a way to fake travel permits and so on. So I think for the majority of the population, the understanding is there. However, the adherence to some of the regulations seem a bit difficult for some to adhere to. Some are citing, of course, that they were not prepared for the situation we're in now. Therefore, they did not make proper prior arrangements, even though there's a grace period of about 3 days to do that. So there is still a lot of challenges with actually convincing people to understand that the regulations have worked so far, and if we want to really curb and rule out the notion of community transmission, we need to adhere more strictly to the regulations put in place, and especially the extension of the lockdown to rule out any possibility of the further spread of the virus.
And you personally, you come to this job at what is an extremely young age, 23. How are you finding it? How are people reacting to you? What's obviously a very important moment for anyone charged with communicating on behalf of a government?
Sorry, could you just repeat that question?
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering how you were dealing with this new job at such a young age and at such an important moment for your country.
It's quite interesting. The past 2 weeks have been very rigorous in the fact that, as you may know, a department or a Ministry of Information Communication Technology now more than ever has a mandate to communicate and give information around preventative about what is going on, because most of the panic comes from people not knowing exactly what is going on and what should they know. So our role really has been to try to get people that information. For 2 weeks, really, my job has been to daily update the nation about what government is doing, what is the plan from an economic perspective, a labor perspective, to actually try to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 in Namibia. So it has been a sort of a baptism by fire, because there's still a lot of doubts about my experience and know-how. However, I think at this point, speaking on a difficult time like this would speak louder than any words.
Thank you very much indeed to Emma Theophilus, Namibia's Deputy Minister for Information, Communication and Technology.
.22 to the hour. Now, the coronavirus pandemic has clearly had a major detrimental impact on the global economy, and we were hearing warnings a little earlier from the United Nations, from the World Food Programme, from their head, David Beasley. portions caused by the trickle-down effects of the pandemic. That's the fear. The stats that the WFP supply are remarkable. They think that the virus could cause a doubling in the number of people around the world suffering acute hunger from 135 million. That's brush. We heard that from Mr. Beasley a little earlier in the programme, talking to Lise Doucette. Let's talk about one place in particular. And when we talk about hunger, there can't be many hungrier places than Yemen, mired, of course, or a long-running humanitarian crisis. Now, currently, when it comes to the virus, there's been one reported case, but obviously the statistics are very hard to compare. We've heard a famine. What does it mean at a local level for Yemen? Sultana Begum is our next guest, advocacy manager for the Norwegian Refugee Council, normally based in Yemen's capital, Sana'a, due to the travel restrictions currently here in London, just for information, but well across the situation. Sultana, to the programme. And first off, what I was wondering was, we talk about panic buying, we talk about lockdown, we talk about stockpiling. I wanted to ask how these things apply in the horribly abnormal situation in Yemen. For example, can people panic buy? Can people stockpile? What has been the response to the threat of the virus in Yemen?
Okay, thank you very much. I'd just like to say that COVID-19 is already a devastating humanitarian crisis. And the Yemeni authorities, like many governments in the world, they're taking, you've mentioned this, lockdown measures so they can combat the spread of the virus. Things as the suspension of flights into the country. Themselves, and on aid organisations like the Norwegian Refugee Council, so preventing large gatherings, there's curfews, road closures, quarantine measures have been introduced, businesses have been closed. So for us, this means we have trouble getting our staff to move around and get to the areas where there are lots of hungry, displaced people that need aid. I myself can't get into the country. Many essential aid workers are also stuck in the country and getting very tired. And so people themselves, they can't access markets, they can't access services. So these things make it very difficult for us to provide aid and food and so forth. But we are still managing to do that, and I can tell you how we do that.
That's interesting. I mean, one thing that does occur is that in is rely imports of in a sense, in a situation, it's not prey to market forces. Now, you've said the difficulties. Are you able to guarantee those aid supplies that the country has basically depended on up until now?
So this is going to be very challenging. So Yemen imports most of its food and medicines. So these essential things that you need, and a lot is commercial supplies coming through the ports. So at the moment, new quarantine measures introduced. With all these new extra checks, etc., it's slowing things down. And then you have road closures and other challenges, which means it's hard to transport goods. That increases the prices. And then you have, of course, globally, the prices of food and other essentials are going up.
An abnormal situation of kind of like lawlessness and government collapse, and yet what you're saying is that in fact regulations are strictly in this abnormal situation to the detriment of the ease of movement of aid.
And also commercial goods. It's commercial food, levels of fuel coming into the country. There were a lot of restriction and delays through Hodeidah port, which is Yemen, at the main port where food and fuel comes in, even before this crisis. So we're really, really concerned. But at the moment, we are still getting food to be.
from the Norwegian Refugee Council, normally based in Yemen's capital, Sana'a. That was Sultana Begum.
America now, where the president has a herbal brew, which he says has cured a number of people from COVID-19. The island nation currently coronavirus. Herbal treatments can prevent all